Anyways, last time I was discussing this discussion and this argument Imam al-Ghazali has. He's showing how everything that is contingent or everything that is newly emergent in the world, or everything that we see in the world around us through sense data, is in fact something which can be considered hadith. And he has discussed how bodies and things which are in motion are hadith, and now has an argument about accidents. And the part before this was that you have bodies which can either be in motion or in rest, and it's quite clear how bodies that are in motion require causes before them, but it might not be as clear as how a body that is in rest is something which must also be hadith. And here he uses an argument from conceivability. He shows that things that are in rest, you can conceive of them as being hadith. So because it's possible to conceive of the things that are in rest to be in motion, they cannot be eternal, since an eternal thing cannot be conceived of as changing. There's a lot of background arguments to prove these things. However, to most people, these kinds of arguments seem quite intuitive, but there is a lot of back and forth here between the theologians and other groups of philosophers. So, such as demonstrating what it means to be at rest, and how rest is in fact the continuous persistence of a body in a place, and whereas motion is the movement of something from one place to another place. But at the end of the day, they are both realities where there is a settlement in a position, regardless if that position is the same as the previous position. And then they argue that, and then there's an argument about how things in their essences are the same if they can be broken down to atoms. And if a body can be broken down to atoms, and all bodies are made up of these atoms, and there's nothing to show or demonstrate how these atoms differ from one another, then they share and they have the same essence. And because they have the same essence, what's possible for one of them is possible for all of them, unless you could give an explanation as to why one atom can't do something that another atom can't, even though they have the same essence. And this is just a general thing in philosophy or theology, where things which share the same essences, like they have the same characteristics, they can replicate what other things that have those characteristics can do. And so likewise, so here you have atoms which are all the same in essence, and because they're all the same in essence and they can move, there's no reason to say that those bodies which are in rest, that are also made up of these atoms, there's nothing to say why they can't move as well. And because they can, and this is a good argument to show how they are hadith, because it's clear how things which are in motion are hadith, and because resting is just another type of not movement but existence in space. And if we break it down to an existence, to that which exists in space is not free of contingency, then even those things which are in rest, they are also contingent. So this is also why we can say a resting atom isn't in motion. So if you want to, even in modern physics today, if you want to describe maybe an atom, and of course this is actually quite far removed from modern physics, because everything's in motion today. So everything is doing some kind of circulation, some kind of orbit. So it might be the planets are orbiting, the sun's orbiting, the galaxy is orbiting, so everything's orbiting. And if you go down to the atom, then you find these atoms within them, these protons and electrons, they are moving as well. And atoms are always moving, they're attracting and they're repelling from one another. So there's movement everywhere, really. So there isn't anything, I don't think, truly we can observe that is at rest. So I think that also cancels out this potential argument. Someone might say that people have, how do you know a body cannot be eternally in rest? But we don't have proof for the existence of anything that is eternal, really, that's at rest now in our perceivable, from amongst the things that we can perceive. And then he has this argument about how accidents, he has an argument about the change of accidents showing things are emergent. So he's still showing how everything we see around us is hadith, including bodies. So he's discussed how bodies and atoms are emergent, and now he wants to explain how accidents are also emergent. And some people argue that so there's this argument here now saying accidents themselves, they don't change, but they just move. from one position to another position. And if it's the case that they're just moving from one position to another position, that doesn't mean that they themselves are changing in their essences. So, and then this counter to Imam Ghazali's position about how accidents show things are emergent. It includes analyzing and comparing accidents to Johar and atom. So, like a Johar, which requires a spatial location, so a Johar and atom, it needs to exist inside space. Then accidents also, they require a mahal. They need to inhere in something, and that's bodies normally. So they're similar in that they require something additional to exist. But then these things which they require to exist, they are entailments for the existences. And as we hinted last time, entailments can be of two types: those which are dhati, which are necessary. So without them, without these necessary entailments, then that essence or that existence cannot be as well. However, some other entailments aren't dhati; they aren't essential to a thing. And he argues that hayz, or something with the space, isn't lazim, isn't a necessary, isn't a dhati lazim for a body or an atom. Because when we think of an atom or a body, we turn our attention to the body or atom first. So if you have a friend called Zaid, then we think of Zaid. We don't think of his location, of his space. And there's a debate also whether space actually even exists, or it's just an illusion or a relation. So this shows how space itself, which is a contested idea, notion, cannot be something which is a dhati, which is an essential entailment or lazim, a dhati lazim of a thing. Whereas accidents, attributes aren't, people normally don't debate whether accidents exist or not. Everyone believes that bodies or things, they have properties. And we touched on this where we said an accident like a feature of Zaid, for example, where he has a certain height or he has certain features. We can't imagine Zaid without these features, without these accidents. You can't, similarly, you can't think of those accidents independently of Zaid, because what makes them the attributes of Zaid when they are independent of him. So this shows that they have a necessary relationship, an essential relationship with one another. And so this shows that the person. So going back, so tying this back to the original point. So people who are arguing that accidents move also, and they aren't subject to change, and they are similar to atoms. That's not the case, because that similarity which we found between them, that atoms exist inside space and accidents also in here in something, that's not a very good analogy. They aren't completely, they are quite dissimilar from an essential perspective in that case. And one thing to note as well, so if the specification is an addition to the essence, then the essence won't diminish because of it. So you could say that when you think of an attribute or a property or an accident, not even an accident, or just an entailment rather of a thing, and when we remove that feature, I guess you could see that specification from that essence, then the essence doesn't really lose anything because of that. And that shows, and this is one way of judging if that entailment is a necessary entailment or an essential entailment or not. Because if you're able to imagine or conceive of a thing in its full form, with its fullness, and it doesn't lose anything from its fullness by eliminating that accident, then this shows that it isn't an essential entailment. Okay, and then he's arguing against an infinite. So some people would argue against this. So the Kalam cosmological argument was that everything that begins to exist requires an explanation. The universe began to exist, so it requires an explanation. Now he wants to defend this second premise, that the universe began to exist. It was something which did not always exist. It had something preceding it. It was originated. So what he says, he believes that if you argue that the universe or created things, the created order, did not have a beginning, then you are essentially saying that it's beginningless, which means it went on forever and ever. Because some people today I've seen argue, actually I'm not sure so much as today, but I've seen this in the classical theological works, where people might argue that we aren't arguing that an infinite amount of things have passed or an infinite, which is something which has no end, has actually come to an end. Rather, we're saying that which precedes us, and that chain of procession, that it goes on without a beginning. But then actually, I guess you could see the intuition there. Just because something doesn't begin doesn't mean that it can't end. I think that's what they're trying to argue, which is a decent argument. I think I read that in Imam Razi. Imam Razi, what he does is he puts his strong arguments and then he argues against himself. He steelmans the opponent's position, and they might not even have that good of an argument, but then he makes it seem really strong. So the counter might be, just because something doesn't have a beginning doesn't mean it doesn't have an end. But then you're denying what Imam Ghazali describes as hadith. He's saying a hadith is something which has a beginning. So now you have, and he's shown how bodies and atoms and accidents have beginnings. So now if you want to run the other argument where things are beginningless, then you have to put forward, because we do agree that there is something which is beginningless and we call that Allah. But you have to then, if you're saying that it's something like a created thing, something which is contingent, which doesn't have a beginning, then you need to put an argument forward to show how something can exist without a beginning. It's just be there forever. And if you're saying that thing which is beginningless is Allah, then that's just, we agree on that anyway. So he's arguing against the infinite because he implies that which has no end has ended. He looks at the revolution of an orbit. So he has some really interesting arguments, and they're still used today. In fact, like William Lane Craig, etc. They use his arguments. I've seen him run this argument against Alex Malpass, and Alex Malpass, who is an atheist, he has to resort to Platonism to essentially stay in the argument. And I just find that absurd. Like, how can you actually argue that there are an infinite amount of things which exist in a realm out there which are independent themselves, just to deny the existence of one independent thing? So he argues that if you look at the revolutions of an orbit and say they can either be an odd number or an even number, and if there was an infinite amount of them, so there's one orbit which is odd, and there's one orbit which is even, and both of these go back infinitely, would they be odd or even? They can't be odd or even. It just doesn't make sense. It leads to an absurd position, because one, we know it's been rotating or revolving an odd amount of times. The other, it's been revolving an even amount of times. But if they've both been going on for an infinite, then surely they should have the same amount of revolutions. But we can observe, for example, let's just say there's a smaller planet that's orbiting a larger planet, then the smaller planet revolves more times than the larger planet would in a specific amount of time. And this shows that they aren't orbiting the same amount. Their orbits are different. They have a different amount of revolutions, and one might be odd and one might be even at any given time, but they won't be the same amount of orbits. But if they were truly infinite, then how could one be odd and one be even? So if it were an infinite, it could not be either of them, since adding it by one would make it odd, and by adding another one, it would become even, which would make no sense if it's truly an infinite. He also looks at the cycle of the sun versus the moon, or versus Saturn. So they each have different cycles. Like, we know this clearly. The sun has a different cycle to the moon or Saturn. But if past events were infinite, how could it be that one cycle has a different number to the other? Right? This is a great argument. If all past events are truly infinite, then how could it be that these different orbits or revolutions have a different number to them? They can't. So this is unlike Allah's infinite attributes, as they are not in relation to numbers. So this is an important thing. Someone might argue, don't you believe that Allah has attributes which are maximum, which are infinite? But when we say Allah's attributes are infinite, we are referring to the qualitative nature. We aren't talking about the quantity, because Allah cannot be divided into parts, in a quantifiable parts. So even if his knowledge encompasses more than his power, because this is a contention, someone might say, oh, but just because the sun has fewer revolutions than the moon, that doesn't mean they can't both be infinite. Don't you also believe that Allah's knowledge is the knowledge of all possibilities? And this even includes the knowledge of impossible things. And you also agree that his power is only in relation to those things which are possible. So Allah, he can't make a square circle, but he has knowledge of a square circle. So that means his knowledge has more, is greater than his power in terms of number. But we aren't talking, when we talk about Allah's attributes, we aren't referring to a number. We aren't saying that infinite number. We're talking about their maximal and maximal, and they are perfect in their by definition. So what does power mean? Qudra means bringing into existence, right? So by power, it refers to the qudra of bringing into existence, which never ceases. So it's a category error. And knowledge means something else. Knowledge is about having awareness of himself and all other things, and power refers to things which he can bring into existence. So it's just a definition issue. So then he has this second claim that, and these are similar. These are kind of like stage 2 arguments. The sabab of the alam, or the cause of the alam. Now he's discussing. All right, is qadim. So he does go into a bit more detail into infinite, and he expands on his arguments. He has about 3 arguments, reasons why. But the 3 points why is basically regarding odd and even numbers, regarding the quantity, and then he argues how the infinity with relation to God isn't referring to the quantity, is referring to how those attributes are maximum in perfection in terms of the meaning. And then he goes on to this second da'wah. So he makes a few claims here. So it's important to recognize that he isn't assuming these things. He isn't saying that these things, we just assume them to be true. He's actually giving an argument for each of these claims. So this book of Creed is a bit more detailed than something like the Tahawiyah, which might just list our beliefs. Here he goes on to explain why we believe in these things briefly, but in a meaningful way. So he says the sabab of the alam is qadim. So that which caused the universe is qadim. Because if it were hadith, if it was something which began to exist, it would need a cause, as he's previously explained. And when he says qadim, he is referring to that which isn't preceded by non-existence. So then if you say something is qadim and hadith at the same time, then it seems to be a contradiction. So because the cause of the universe cannot also be a hadith thing, because that would also be part of the universe then. So it needs to be explained in terms of something other than itself. This is something which is quite common. How you could say the set of even numbers are explained by odd numbers, etc. So the set of all things which come into existence are explained by virtue of that which does not come into existence. So Allah is that which does not come into existence, and this is what he means by qadim. So something which is qadim cannot be hadith, cannot be something which came into existence. So it's a brief argument there. He doesn't really need to detail too much about that. لا تظن أن القدم معنى زائدا على ذات القديم. Don't assume that by the meaning of eternity is an additional meaning to the essence of Allah the Qadim. فيلزمك أن تقول ذلك المعنى أيضا قديم بقدم زائد عليه. That will entail you saying that there's also this meaning of Qadim, which is an additional meaning. ويتسلسل القول إلى غير نهاية. And this could go on forever, like without an end. Like if you want to describe that other meaning as well, and then you have to describe that meaning as well, and then you have to describe that meaning as well, and it's like an infinite regress. You'll find that most of the theologians, they don't hold to a benign infinite regress. They usually, when they see infinite regress, they just run away from it. They say, no, that's wrong, that's absurd. Because nowadays some people do categorize them as benign and malignant infinite regresses, but really if you want to have a strong argument, you want to keep it robust, so try to avoid having these absurdities involved in your conclusions, because that's a very big cost. So when I say it's not towards Platonism as well, because the Platonic realms, if you say that meaning is something which exists out there, then that's what Platonism really is. So we're not saying Qadim is something which exists. The meaning of Qadim, the word Qadim, eternal itself, that meaning, it's a form that exists out there in some realm, and God depends on this meaning which comes from that realm to be eternal, to exemplify the eternal nature. No, we are saying that being eternal for Allah is something which is embedded within His essence. So his key reason, whatever is eternal has no beginning, it cannot come to an end, because if it did, a change would occur from existence to non-existence. All changes require a cause. Since non-existence would be something new, a hadith, it would need a reason or cause. But there's no meaningful cause for non-existence. Either the cause would be a doer acting to bring about non-existence, or the removal of a condition for existence. Neither works. An agent like God, Allah, can bring things into existence, but non-existence is not a real thing that can be caused or done. Non-existence is just absence. It's not an act, so it can't be the result of power. Conclusion. Since there's no coherent way for God's non-existence to occur, He must be everlasting, just as He is pre-eternal. So this is so when I said Allah was Qadim, so here is also saying that this ties into the third claim, which was that الدعوة الثالثة الذي أن صانع العالم صانع العالم مع كونه موجودا لم يزل فهو باق لا يزال. So whilst also being pre-eternal, he is also post-eternal, meaning he doesn't cease to exist. And I just gave the reasoning why. And inshallah, I'll carry on next time from the fourth claim.